In the summer of 1815, the world held its breath. Europe, ravaged by more than 2 decades of war, was at the precipice of another turning point. The fate of nations hung in the balance as Napoleon Bonaparte, the once exiled Emperor of France, returned to reclaim his throne. The battle that would decide his destiny, and perhaps the future of all of Europe, was set: Waterloo. The outcome of that fateful conflict has been etched into history as a decisive victory for the British-led coalition, sealing Napoleon's fate and ensuring the peace that followed at the Congress of Vienna. But what if it had been different? What if Napoleon's genius on the battlefield had once again outshone his enemies, and he had triumphed at Waterloo? What if, instead of exile, he returned to France a conquering hero, his imperial vision renewed, reshaping the future of Europe and the world? Could Napoleon have regained his former glory, and, if so, at what cost? This what-if scenario takes us into a world where the stakes of the battle were radically different, one where the French Empire, instead of falling, rose again. A victory at Waterloo would have altered the trajectory of European and world history, leading to a new order that could have affected everything from the balance of power in Europe to the course of colonization, the fate of revolution, and the very foundations of modern diplomacy. Now, let's venture into the unknown and imagine the world through Napoleon's victorious eyes. The year 1815 was a crossroads in European history. For 2 decades, Europe had been torn apart by the rise and fall of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose imperial ambitions had reshaped the continent. From the ashes of the French Revolution, Napoleon had ascended to power, first as a military leader, then as the self-crowned Emperor of France. Under his rule, France became the dominant power in Europe, and Napoleon's military genius seemed unstoppable. His campaigns had rewritten the map of Europe, creating alliances, defeating coalitions, and establishing the Napoleonic Code, which would influence legal systems around the world for generations. But by 1814, even Napoleon's brilliance had its limits. After a series of military defeats and the overwhelming pressure of multiple coalitions, France had been invaded. The British, Russians, Prussians, Austrians, and Spaniards had formed an alliance that ultimately forced Napoleon into abdication. The emperor was exiled to the small island of Elba, and Europe's monarchs, eager to restore the old order, convened at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the map of Europe, hoping to ensure that such a disruptive force would never rise again. Yet Napoleon was not done. In March 1815, he escaped from Elba, landing on the French coast and rallying his supporters, a mixture of soldiers and civilians disillusioned by the Bourbon monarchy that had been reinstated in his absence. Within days, he marched on Paris and reclaimed his throne, much to the dismay of the European powers. The era of Napoleonic Wars was about to return, and Europe's fate would be decided on the battlefield once more. Napoleon's return sparked what would become the 100 Days, a brief but intense period in which Napoleon sought to restore his empire and reassert his dominance. The European powers, alarmed by his audacity and resolve, quickly mobilized to defeat him. An allied army composed of British, Dutch, Belgian, and Prussian forces gathered under the command of the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian general Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Napoleon, however, believed that he could defeat each of the armies in turn before they could fully unite against him. On June 18, 1815, the stage was set for the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon's forces, numbering around 73,000 men, faced off against an allied army of about 68,000. The battlefield was a muddy, sodden expanse in what is now modern-day Belgium. The stakes could not have been higher. Napoleon's victory would mean the continuation of the French Empire, the restoration of his vision for Europe, and the potential reshaping of the entire world order. A defeat, however, would mean his final fall from power, the collapse of his empire, and the return of the old monarchies. For Napoleon, Waterloo was a test of his military brilliance, a final chance to prove that he could still outmaneuver his enemies. For Europe, it was a defining moment. A victory for Napoleon would challenge the very foundations of the peace that had been tentatively established after his first downfall. A restored Napoleon would inevitably alter the terms of the Congress of Vienna, throwing Europe back into turmoil and reigniting the struggles for supremacy between the great powers. But history knows what happened. Despite his tactical acumen, Napoleon was ultimately defeated. His forces were worn down by exhaustion, weather, and the relentless pressure of the Allied armies. The Prussians, under Blücher, arrived just in time to turn the tide in Wellington's favor, and Napoleon's hopes of victory crumbled. With his defeat, Napoleon was exiled once more, this time to the remote island of St. Helena, where he would die 6 years later. Europe returned to a fragile peace, but the effects of Napoleon's wars continue to reverberate through the 19th century. So, what does this historical moment mean for us today? The Battle of Waterloo wasn't just the end of one man's ambitions. It marked the final curtain on a period of European history where military conquest, imperialism, and the balance of power were the driving forces behind global politics. The Congress of Vienna set the stage for a century of relative peace in Europe, but it also established a world order where old monarchies dominated, and revolutionary ideas struggled to find purchase. Had Napoleon won at Waterloo, the ripple effects would have been profound. Perhaps the age of revolutions would have played out differently. Perhaps nationalism, democracy, and the modern political landscape would have developed along an entirely different path. The story of Napoleon at Waterloo is not just a tale of one man's fate. It is a window into the forces that shaped the world we live in today. And if the outcome of that battle had been different, we would be left asking, how would the world have been changed? June 18, 1815. The sun was setting over the Belgian countryside, casting a golden hue over the mist-drenched fields of Waterloo. The thunder of cannons reverberated in the distance, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The tension was palpable. But this time, the outcome was not set in stone. In an alternate reality, the storm that would tear across the battlefield would not tear down Napoleon's dreams, but instead push them higher. In this alternate timeline, the critical moment that would alter the fate of Europe comes just as Napoleon faces his most daunting challenge. The battle is still underway, but the final hours take an unexpected turn. By all accounts, Napoleon's plan was audacious, but not without merit. He sought to divide and conquer, attacking the Allies before they could fully unite. His strategy had worked in the past, but the battlefield was unpredictable, and the tide of war had begun to turn. Wellington, who had held his ground in the center, was being pushed back, and the Prussian forces, under the command of General Blücher, were rapidly approaching from the east, threatening to overwhelm Napoleon's forces. However, in this diverging timeline, fate shifts in a crucial moment. As the Prussians close in, Napoleon's elite Imperial Guard, instead of being held in reserve, is committed at the right time, sweeping across the battlefield with their famed precision and discipline. Wellington, stunned by the unexpected ferocity of Napoleon's attack, struggles to rally his forces. The Prussian reinforcements, which had been the key to turning the tide in the original timeline, are delayed in their advance. This delay is not due to any tactical error on Blücher's part, but rather a combination of unfavorable weather and miscommunications among the Prussian corps commanders. As the battle rages, Napoleon's strategic genius shines through. His ability to read the battlefield and make bold, decisive moves is on full display. His infantry, particularly the French cuirassiers, break through the Allied lines, creating a gap that Napoleon exploits with a devastating cavalry charge. It is a moment of brilliance, reminiscent of his earlier victories at Austerlitz and Wagram. The French troops, who had been demoralized by years of warfare, are suddenly reinvigorated by the success. Their confidence is renewed. They can feel victory within their grasp. Napoleon, sensing the moment, leads the charge himself. His presence on the front lines is electrifying, and his troops rally around him with the fervor of men who believe that the dream of a restored French Empire is within reach. In this key moment, the Allies begin to falter. Wellington, though a brilliant strategist, is unable to recover from the sudden and brutal shift in momentum. The Prussian reinforcements, still delayed, are too far out of reach to affect the battle. And so, the balance tips decisively in Napoleon's favor. By late afternoon, as the sun sinks below the horizon, the Allied lines are in disarray. Wellington's forces, exhausted and disheartened by the unexpected ferocity of Napoleon's assault, begin to retreat. The Prussians, who had been Napoleon's greatest threat on this day, are now scattered, unable to bring their full strength to bear. Napoleon has won. The battlefield is his. As the French army surges forward, victory is sealed. The Allied commanders, forced to acknowledge defeat, retreat in chaos. Napoleon, though battered and bruised, stands victorious, his enemies in disarray. The world now faces a new reality, a reality where Napoleon, instead of being captured and exiled, triumphs. His victory at Waterloo doesn't just preserve his reign, it alters the course of European and world history in ways that are difficult to fathom. The immediate aftermath of the battle would be a celebration in Paris as Bonaparte's loyalists and former soldiers returned to their posts, and France, now under Napoleon's command once again, breathes a collective sigh of relief. In the royal palaces of Europe, however, the mood is grim. The British, who had banked on a decisive victory over Napoleon, are forced to reconsider their alliances. The Austrian and Russian powers, too, will find themselves in a precarious position. The Congress of Vienna, which had been assembling to restore the old monarchies and create a stable peace, is thrown into disarray. What would a world look like if Napoleon were victorious, the Bourbons were deposed, and the old monarchies of Europe were thrown into chaos? Napoleon's first order of business would be to consolidate his power in France. The French people, who had witnessed the return of their emperor, would rally around him once more. The reforms of the Napoleonic Code, which had spread throughout Europe, would likely be extended further, solidifying Napoleon's influence on European legal systems. A wave of nationalist sentiment would sweep across the continent, with many regions, especially those in the former Holy Roman Empire, seeing Napoleon as a liberator. The idea of a unified Europe under a single banner, under Napoleon's leadership, would gain traction, shifting the political landscape of the entire continent. Beyond Europe, Napoleon's victory would have far-reaching consequences. The French Empire, rather than shrinking, could expand its reach, taking advantage of the chaos in the European political system. France would continue to influence and dominate colonial territories, particularly in Africa and the Americas. The question of slavery in French colonies, which had been a source of tension during Napoleon's reign, might have been resolved in his favor, creating a different dynamic in the global economy. On the other hand, the victorious Napoleon would not have remained unchallenged for long. His enemies, now nursing the wounds of defeat, would not easily forget the power he had once held, nor the threat he posed to the stability of their monarchies. A new coalition could form, eager to bring him down once again. The specter of war would continue to hang over Europe, but now, with a reinvigorated French Empire, the stakes would be higher. The world would have taken a radically different direction, one where Napoleon's dream of a united Europe under his rule was no longer a mere fantasy. This new world order would be defined by Napoleon's vision, with Europe and beyond forever altered by the legacy of his victory at Waterloo. The question remains, how would the world have evolved under this new order? Would Napoleon's reign have brought peace and prosperity, or would the forces of revolution, nationalism, and resistance eventually topple his empire? The divergence at Waterloo set the stage for a new chapter in history, one where the echoes of Napoleon's ambitions would resonate far beyond the fields of Belgium. Napoleon's victory at Waterloo had shattered the fragile peace Europe had known since his first exile, and the world was about to be thrust back into the chaos of war and revolution. While the immediate aftermath seemed like a triumph for the French emperor, the road ahead was fraught with tension, danger, and the unpredictable forces that always seemed to conspire against him. His victory was not a guarantee of long-term stability. Far from it. The great powers of Europe had already shown their capacity to unite against Napoleon once before, and the forces that had once been united against him now found themselves torn between the fear of his return and the desire to curb his ambitions. The first challenge came not from the battlefield, but from the halls of diplomacy. Napoleon's restoration of the French Empire was a direct challenge to the delicate order established by the Congress of Vienna. In this alternate timeline, the great European monarchs, particularly Tsar Alexander I of Russia, Emperor Francis II of Austria, and King Frederick William III of Prussia, could not afford to let Napoleon's victory go unchallenged. But now, the question was no longer how to defeat him, the man who had seemingly risen from the ashes of history, but how to confront a new, emboldened French Empire with more strength and determination than ever before. While the European monarchs braced themselves for war, they were also acutely aware of the growing sense of unrest that simmered beneath the surface of their empires. Napoleon's legacy, far from being extinguished by his exile, had left an indelible mark on Europe. The Napoleonic Code, with its principles of equality before the law and meritocracy, had gained traction in many regions, particularly in those parts of Europe that had been under French control. In Italy, Germany, and Spain, a wave of nationalist movements began to swell. Movements that saw in Napoleon a symbol of revolutionary change, a figure who had fought for the people rather than for the aristocracy. These revolutions were not the same as the French Revolution of 1789, but they were deeply inspired by its ideals. The old monarchies found themselves on the defensive, confronted by both the remnants of revolutionary fervor and the ever-present threat of Napoleon's imperial ambitions. One of the first countries to feel the pressure was Spain. The Spanish peninsula had been a battleground during the Napoleonic Wars, and though Napoleon had been driven out of Iberia, his influence had not vanished. In this new timeline, the Spanish liberals, empowered by Napoleon's return, began to push for a constitutional monarchy that would strip the absolute power from their king, Ferdinand VII. By 1816, an uprising in Madrid resulted in the formation of the Spanish Cortes, a representative assembly inspired by the ideas of the French Revolution. The Bourbon monarchy, still shaky after the tumultuous years of the Napoleonic Wars, struggled to maintain its grip on power. Spanish revolutionaries sought not only to rid themselves of their king's autocratic rule, but also to align themselves more closely with Napoleon's vision for a united Europe, one in which nationalist and liberal ideals could flourish. But the unrest in Spain was just the beginning. In Italy, the various city-states and principalities, which had been divided under the rule of the Austrian Empire, began to demand greater autonomy. Naples, which had been a French satellite during Napoleon's reign, saw another round of revolts. The people of Milan, Turin, and Florence, influenced by the revolutionary fervor in France, began to question why their lands should remain under foreign control. The rise of the Carbonari, a secret society devoted to Italian unification, was a direct result of Napoleon's influence. These movements did not openly declare allegiance to Napoleon. Their loyalty was more to the ideas he represented, the promotion of nationalism, and the overthrow of aristocratic rule. Napoleon, however, was not content to simply watch these revolutions unfold. Though his victory at Waterloo had secured his throne, it had also raised his profile as the symbol of European power. He sought to steer the waves of revolution in directions that would strengthen his empire and his imperial vision. To this end, Napoleon began to use his influence to guide these nationalist movements, but with a clear caveat: any new republics or independent states would be aligned with France. By 1817, Napoleon began a series of covert maneuvers to support Italian and Spanish rebels, offering both military aid and diplomatic recognition to those who were willing to align with him. This strategy, though successful in stoking unrest across Europe, would ultimately backfire. The monarchies were soon forced to confront not just Napoleon's military power, but the looming specter of revolution at their doorsteps. As Europe began to buckle under the weight of these revolutionary movements, a new coalition began to form against Napoleon, not just a military one, but a political one. The monarchies, wary of Napoleon's influence, were forced to reckon with the fact that they could not contain his power by themselves. By 1818, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria entered into a new alliance, not merely to defeat Napoleon on the battlefield, but to suppress the growing revolutionary sentiment that his return had stoked. This coalition, however, was not without its internal tensions. Tsar Alexander I, who had once fought against Napoleon on the battlefield, now found himself caught between his desire to curb revolutionary fervor and his growing fear of Napoleon's imperial reach. Napoleon's vision of a Europe united under his banner of liberalism and nationalism was not something that Alexander could simply ignore. He saw in Napoleon the specter of a new form of autocracy, one that threatened the status quo of monarchies across Europe. Yet his fear of revolution was so great that he was forced to tread cautiously, occasionally offering olive branches to Napoleon even as he prepared for another war. The first major clash came in 1819 when Napoleon attempted to extend his influence into the Netherlands, capitalizing on the instability created by revolution. The Dutch, with their own grievances against their monarchy, had begun to experience political unrest, and Napoleon moved swiftly to insert himself into the situation. British and Prussian forces responded quickly, sending a message that any further French expansion would be met with resistance. But Napoleon, ever the strategist, knew that he could not simply rely on military power. He would need to navigate the increasingly complex web of alliances revolutionary movements, and monarchist ambitions that had emerged in the wake of his victory. In the early months of 1820, Napoleon found himself facing a two-front struggle. On one side, he had to contend with the monarchist coalition, which was determined to check his power and prevent any further territorial expansion. On the other side, he had to navigate the rising tide of revolution, not just in Spain and Italy, but now even in Germany, where students and intellectuals began to push for a unified German state free from Austrian and Prussian domination. Napoleon, sensing the winds of change, worked to position himself as both the protector of revolutionary ideals and the defender of his empire. His empire had become both a beacon for nationalism and a symbol of the power of the French state. But the revolutionary tide was proving to be a double-edged sword. As Napoleon fostered rebellion in one part of Europe, he simultaneously faced internal dissent. The French people, worn by years of war, were growing weary of Napoleon's continual expansionist ambitions. Economic instability, coupled with growing militarism, threatened to fracture his support base. Even in France, the specter of revolution, the very thing that Napoleon had fought to suppress, began to rise again. Napoleon's response was to tighten his grip on power. By 1822, he had forged a precarious alliance with Spain's revolutionary factions, offering military support in exchange for loyalty to France. But as Spain descended further into civil war and France's resources became more stretched, Napoleon's imperial ambitions faced their greatest challenge yet. The struggle for dominance in Europe was now a delicate balance between revolutionary fervor, nationalist movements, and the desperate maneuvers of a man who had risen, fallen, and risen again. The tension was palpable, and no one could predict where the balance would tip. The year is 1823, and Europe is on the brink. Napoleon, having weathered a storm of revolutions, military skirmishes, and diplomatic maneuvering, finds himself once again on the precipice of an all-out war with the combined forces of Europe. His imperial ambitions have stretched across the continent, but now, as the monarchies of Europe consolidate their power and the revolutionary fervor he once championed begins to wane, the stakes have never been higher. The battle that would decide Europe's fate is about to unfold, not on the fields of Belgium, as it had in 1815, but in the heart of Europe, in the strategic crossroads of the Rhine Valley. Napoleon has moved his forces into Germany, aiming to secure a decisive victory over the coalition of Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia. The goal, to strike at the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, where Austria and Prussia hold sway, and force a settlement that would solidify his control over Europe once and for all. But Napoleon's enemies are ready, and they are no longer divided. The battlefield is set. The great armies of Europe have converged. On one side stands Napoleon, commanding his imperial guard, his elite cavalry, and his seasoned veterans, a force forged through decades of war and victories. On the other side stands the coalition army, a massive alliance led by Tsar Alexander I of Russia, King Frederick William III of Prussia, and the Duke of Wellington, who has once again taken command of the British forces. The tension between these two armies is palpable. The fate of Europe, the future of monarchies and republics, the legacy of revolution, all of it hangs in the balance. Napoleon's strategy is bold. He intends to crush the coalition's forces before they can fully unite, as he has done countless times before. He knows the weakness of the Allied forces, the lack of coordination between them, the rivalry between Britain and Russia, and the uncertainty of their leadership. His plan is simple: strike fast, break their lines, and force a quick decision. But the conditions are not in his favor. The battle begins with the thunderous roar of artillery, a sound that reverberates across the Rhine. Napoleon's troops advance, their movements precise, the famous French discipline on full display. His cavalry charges, slicing through the early defenses, forcing the coalition to retreat. For a moment, it seems as though history is repeating itself. The French Empire, like a tide, pushing back the forces of monarchism. But as Napoleon presses forward, the situation begins to shift. The unthinkable happens. Tsar Alexander, who had once been an unpredictable and wavering leader, steps forward and takes command of the Russian forces with a clarity and decisiveness that had been absent in previous campaigns. Alexander, often seen as an indecisive and idealistic monarch, now reveals his true strategic brilliance. He has learned from Napoleon's moves, anticipating his maneuvers and positioning his forces to counter the French attack. Meanwhile, the British forces, under Wellington, adapt rapidly. They've learned Napoleon's tactics, and they are ready to fight him on his terms. The battlefield becomes a swirling maelstrom of gunfire and smoke. The French Imperial Guard, which Napoleon had committed to the front lines, faces an unexpected resistance. The Russian and Prussian infantry hold their ground, defying Napoleon's assumption that they would crumble under pressure. As the day drags on, the weather turns. A sudden storm drenches the battlefield, turning the earth into a quagmire. Napoleon's cavalry, which had been his greatest asset, is slowed, bogged down by the mud. The French artillery struggles to maintain its effectiveness in the heavy rain. Napoleon, ever the master strategist, attempts to shift his focus. He orders a strategic withdrawal, hoping to regroup and launch a second wave of attacks. But as his forces fall back, the unexpected occurs. The Prussian army, long held in reserve, finally arrives on the field in full force, charging forward with all the fury of a nation determined to end Napoleon's reign. This is the moment the French had dreaded, the one thing they hadn't counted on. The Prussian reinforcements, who had previously been delayed by the revolution in Spain, have arrived, and they are relentless. The Prussians, with their famed discipline and precision, push forward with unrelenting force, flanking Napoleon's forces on both sides. The battle, which had seemed so promising for the French just hours earlier, now teeters on the edge of disaster. Napoleon's forces are surrounded, their lines beginning to crumble under the weight of the Allied pressure. The French soldiers, exhausted from years of war, begin to lose heart. The Emperor, ever the symbol of French strength and hope, watches as the reality of his situation sets in. The turning point comes as the battle reaches its peak. Napoleon, recognizing the gravity of the moment, issues one last command, a desperate gamble that could either turn the tide or lead to his undoing. He orders the last reserve, the elite French Imperial Guard, to make one final all-or-nothing charge. These men, loyal to their emperor, move forward with the fury of a dying empire, cutting through the lines of the Prussian cavalry. For a moment, it seems as though Napoleon's legendary resolve might win the day. But then, in a moment that would be etched into the annals of history, Napoleon is struck by a crippling realization. The Prussian army has not only overwhelmed his forces, but the British have closed in, their artillery now taking a deadly toll on the French ranks. Napoleon's Imperial Guard, despite their fierce loyalty and indomitable will, is finally faltering. The charge begins to stall, the momentum lost, and with it, any hope of a decisive victory. It is here, at this pivotal moment, that Napoleon's fate is sealed. The battle, once a potential triumph for the French Empire, has become an unmitigated disaster. Napoleon, wounded in both body and spirit, realizes that his empire cannot survive the combined might of Europe. The Emperor, once a man of unshakable confidence, now faces the crushing reality that his second reign will come to an end. The French troops, in disarray, begin to fall back in defeat, while the coalition forces, victorious, surge forward. The battle at the Rhine becomes known as the final reckoning. Napoleon, now a symbol of defiance against the European monarchies, has been undone not by his enemy's brilliance, but by the limits of his own empire. His vision of a unified Europe under French rule crumbles, and with it, the dream of a new world order. The monarchy's power, though shaken, remains unbroken, and Europe begins to turn its gaze toward the future, a future without Napoleon. In that moment, with the battle fading into history, Europe changes once again. The world that might have been, a Europe united under Napoleon's banner, slips through his fingers like sand, and the empire he built is undone by the very forces he sought to control. The legacy of Napoleon, like the mist of the battlefield, is left to linger in the air, a story of ambition, genius, and eventual defeat. The defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of the Rhine marks the end of a grand experiment, a vision for a united Europe under French imperial rule. His once mighty empire collapses in on itself, shattered by the combined forces of Europe's monarchies and the relentless surge of revolution. But as the dust settles and Europe emerges from the shadow of Napoleon's ambition, what becomes of the continent? What world does Napoleon's failure create? In the immediate aftermath, Napoleon is forced to retreat, and the once great emperor, now a symbol of broken dreams, is exiled once again. But this time, there is no island of Elba waiting for him. His fate is sealed in the annals of history. Yet, the consequences of his failed campaign ripple far beyond his personal downfall. Napoleon's defeat changes the course of European history, ensuring that his imperial vision, a Europe bound together by his reign, will never come to pass. With Napoleon's defeat, the European monarchies, once fractured and fearful of his power, are emboldened. The Congress of Vienna, which had been established to redraw Europe's political map after the Napoleonic Wars, is revived with renewed vigor. The great powers of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain reaffirm their commitment to the concert of Europe, a system designed to maintain balance and prevent the rise of any one power that might disrupt the fragile peace. The monarchs, particularly Tsar Alexander I and King Frederick William III, see their status strengthened, and Europe settles into a new era of conservative rule. However, the victory over Napoleon does not bring an era of unchallenged stability. His influence, although diminished, has left a deep imprint on European society. The Napoleonic Code, with its principles of legal equality, merit-based advancement, and secularism, cannot be easily erased. Across Europe, movements for nationalism and liberalism continue to simmer, inspired by the revolution Napoleon had once led. While the monarchies may have triumphed in the immediate conflict, they find themselves facing a growing tide of change that will not be easily suppressed. In Spain, where Napoleon's victory had reignited revolutionary fervor, a constitutional monarchy takes shape, but the country remains divided. The Spanish liberals, though stymied by the monarchists in the short term, find themselves with a foothold in power. The Cortes of Cádiz, the Spanish parliament established during the Napoleonic occupation, continues to press for constitutional reforms, laying the groundwork for future uprisings and the eventual establishment of a liberal Spain. In Italy, the various nationalist movements that Napoleon had once championed do not simply vanish. The Carbonari and other secret societies, motivated by ideals of Italian unification, continue to push for a unified state. While the Austrian Empire maintains a strong presence in the north, the people of Italy are emboldened by the ideals Napoleon introduced. The dream of a united, independent Italy will not die easily, and it will eventually lead to the Risorgimento, the movement for Italian unification. While Napoleon's empire is no more, the post-Napoleonic order is not one of quiet submission to the old monarchies. Instead, Europe enters a new phase of competition, with tensions running high between the conservative monarchies and the rising tide of nationalist and liberal movements. The balance of power that the concert of Europe sought to maintain becomes increasingly fragile. The Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1829, sparked by nationalist fervor and a desire for freedom from the Ottoman Empire, is one such sign of the growing dissatisfaction with the status quo. The European powers, especially Russia and Britain, intervene not to preserve monarchy, but to support the rise of a nationalist state. This intervention becomes a key indicator of the changing tide. In Germany, the Holy Roman Empire may have been formally dissolved in 1806, but its legacy lives on in the fractured states of the Confederation of the Rhine. The Burschenschaften, student societies advocating for German unity, begin to gain traction, inspired by the wave of revolution sweeping through Europe. The demand for German unification, which Napoleon had temporarily stifled, grows stronger in the aftermath of his fall. Over the next several decades, the German states begin to coalesce under the pressure of both liberal reforms and nationalist movements, eventually leading to the creation of the German Empire in 1871, but not before decades of struggle and conflict. The Austrian Empire, which had always been a staunch opponent of Napoleon, finds itself weakened by the continuing unrest in Italy and Germany. Though Austria retains its territorial holdings, it can no longer impose its authority with the same unchecked power. The monarchy is forced to deal with internal dissent, particularly from the Hungarian and Czech peoples, whose national aspirations continue to rise in the wake of Napoleon's fall. On the other side of the Channel, Britain emerges from the Napoleonic Wars relatively unscathed. However, the war had drained Britain's resources, and its economy, though resilient, is burdened by the cost of the conflict. The end of Napoleon's threat leads Britain to turn more attention to its empire, particularly its growing interests in India and the Americas. The British Empire, now firmly established as the world's foremost colonial power, shifts its focus to consolidating its global holdings. But with Europe stabilized, Britain faces a new challenge: how to deal with the rising movements for independence in its colonies. Latin American revolutions, already in motion during the Napoleonic era, gain momentum as former colonies break free from the Spanish Empire. In South America, Simón Bolívar leads the charge for independence, and Britain finds itself both a supporter and a competitor as new nations begin to rise from the ashes of empire. In India, British control expands during this time, but it does so with an eye toward preventing uprisings and maintaining order. The Napoleonic Wars had spread the seeds of discontent among the Indian rulers, and in the decades following Napoleon's fall, the British Empire faces a growing challenge in consolidating its control over the subcontinent. As Europe moves forward, the question remains: would the world be better or worse off without Napoleon's empire? In some ways, Europe's monarchies are able to reassert their power. The old aristocratic systems endure, but they do so at the cost of political repression, stifling the aspirations of growing nationalist and liberal movements. The ideal of a unified Europe, a Europe that Napoleon had sought to create, is delayed, but it is not destroyed. The European Union, which would later emerge in the 20th century, is the heir to the dream Napoleon once harbored. Yet the path to that dream is more tumultuous and protracted. Wars and revolutions would continue to ravage Europe throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and the old monarchies, though victorious in the short term, face increasing resistance from the people they seek to govern. On a global scale, Napoleon's defeat means a more fragmented world, one in which empires rise and fall, where nationalist movements emerge stronger, and where the old order is continually challenged. Though Napoleon's vision of a united Europe may never have come to pass, his influence remains, both in the ideals he championed and in the deep scars left by his wars. In the end, Napoleon's fall does not lead to a peaceful, unified Europe. Instead, it gives birth to an era of nationalism, revolution, and imperialism, where the balance of power shifts continually, and the world must come to terms with the legacy of his ambition. A world that may have been better or worse, depending on which side of history you stand. As we look back on the path not taken, the Europe that might have been if Napoleon had triumphed, we are left with an essential question: did this alternate history improve upon the original, or did it simply lead to worse consequences? On one hand, Napoleon's vision of a united Europe, forged by the strength of his empire, would have meant the end of centuries-old monarchies, the rise of a more egalitarian and meritocratic society, and perhaps an earlier push toward European unity, a continent less divided, more interconnected, with common goals. His reforms, particularly the Napoleonic Code, shaped legal systems for generations. If Napoleon had succeeded, might Europe have avoided the devastating wars of the 19th and early 20th centuries? Could the continent have been spared the two world wars, the rise of fascism and communism, and the political fragmentation that defined much of the modern era? On the other hand, Napoleon's empire was built on imperial ambition and military conquest. His dreams of a united Europe came at a terrible cost: countless lives lost in battle, political upheaval, and the suppression of national identities. A Europe under Napoleon's iron fist might have been more efficient, but at the expense of freedom, diversity, and the self-determination of its peoples. Even after his defeat, his vision lingered, influencing nationalist movements and fueling revolutionary fervor across the continent. Was Napoleon's grand plan a fleeting hope of peace and prosperity, or was it a vision doomed to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions? As we reflect on these possibilities, we are reminded that history is never a straight line. The decisions made in the past, the victories and defeats, the what-ifs, continue to shape the world we live in today. Would a Europe under Napoleon have been better? Worse? We may never know for certain, but the questions linger, urging us to think critically about the paths we choose and the futures they create. In the end, the story of Napoleon's rise and fall is not just about the fate of an empire, but about the ways in which history is shaped by vision, ambition, and the choices of those who dare to change the course of nations. The world that might have been is always worth contemplating, but it's the world we have now that demands our attention and our action. What other what-ifs will shape the future? It's a question we must all consider,